Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Well, the wheel is turning and we're back to where we were 100 years ago. Let's find out more from Stacy.
Max, it has dawned on me that the roaring 20s are back. Yes, history is actually seemingly repeating itself, in fact, not just rhyming. So, incomes are up 21% since last March and up 33% from 2019. Consumer spending, highest ever. Stock markets, all-time highs. And let's first look at Charlie Munger. He's a partner with Warren Buffett over at Berkshire Hathaway, and of course, is from the 1920s. He was born in 1924, so he will remember as a little child, a baby flapper, that the roaring 20s. Charlie Munger on Bitcoin today. Quote, I should say modestly that I think the whole damn development is disgusting and contrary to the interests of civilization. He owns banks that launder billions per year and have been charged criminally. Give me a break, says Anthony Pompliano.
Right. Pomp makes a good observation there. 75% of the Berkshire Hathaway portfolio, when you break it down, is banks. And the banks are the first in line from the central banks to get all the bailout money. Remember, Berkshire Hathaway has been bailed out twice. Without those bailouts, they would have been bankrupt long ago. They're underperforming even with the bailouts. They're still underperforming the S&P and NASDAQ for more than 10 years. These guys are they're bums. They're charity cases, right? So, and you say income is up 30%. To be clear, that's not wage, that's income. So it's people getting minimum wage plus government transfer payments that are being stuffed into their mailboxes. Well, Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, their income is up by billions because instead of getting $1,800 or $2,000 from the government, they get 10, 15, 20 billion dollars from the government. But they're no different because they've never invented anything. They've never built anything. They just sit in their chair down Omaha, Nebraska, and wait for the government to send them money. And that's all they do. And they're bums and they're parasites.
The thing is, his statement does expose, first of all, he said, Bitcoin, he hates the success of Bitcoin. And what the success of Bitcoin does is expose the entirety of the lie of the financial system of which he has benefited enormously. But it also shows you that for all their smarts and all their value investing and looking, digging into the books and examining the books of these companies and meeting the CEOs and doing all the due diligence, that's a waste of time and money in a roaring 20s when money is being thrown out the door like Spanky back in the 20s and the Little Rascals throwing money out the window. Well, that's what the government is doing. And so you don't need to be any smarter than a monkey. And some people say Charlie Munger kind of looks like one, but the fact is anybody can make money. And that is shown as you mentioned, Warren Buffett buys more of his new favorite stock, Berkshire Hathaway, but is a net seller on market as S&P 500 set record highs and the Buffett indicator raises the alarm. Total U.S. market cap is now equal to 226% of U.S. GDP, way above the 100% that Buffett sets as his bubble threshold. So over twice as high. Anybody who bet on the bubble is winning. Of course, those value investors are the sort that will get out of the market thinking, oh, this is a bubble. He would have got out at 100%, started scaling out, and it's now doubled since then. But this is the roaring 20s.
Right. Well, this is where it gets pernicious and ugly in the fiat money world with Munger and Buffett, because they use the billions that the government gives them to lobby the government to do things like repeal Glass-Steagall under the Clinton administration, or to get rid of the laws that prevented companies from buying back their own stock, which is what happened under Reagan, because it's patently market manipulation and stock manipulation to buy back your own stock. And when you can do that with money that the government's giving you for free or at a 0% interest rate, you're clearly in a predatory position that's bankrupting large swathes of the economy and causing unemployment and causing these deaths of despair. The number of opiate overdose deaths last year up by 20,000 to 90,000. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Warren.
Obviously, they have like more than $150 billion just sitting there like a melting ice cube in their treasury, just sitting there doing nothing because they look around and they see nothing worth investing in. But this is at the end of the past 20 years since they did lobby for the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the hollowing out of the U.S. economy. And in fact, he also mentioned at this point, by the way, at the shareholder meeting this past weekend, that Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan, and some others were going to take on the healthcare racket in America. And he said something along the lines of like, well, this racket is bigger than us, right? It's 17% of the U.S. GDP, and these powerful multi-billionaires running the financial sector couldn't make inroads into it because of the predatory, those sort of moats that they set up around their racket.
Very telling that Buffett referred to America's healthcare system as a racket. And, a lot of people describe America as an emergency hospital waiting room disguised as a country.
Yeah, well, I might have put words in his mouth by saying he said a racket, but that's how I read what he said, is that it was a total racket that even the likes of he could not.
Yeah, I read the quote. It was something, he mentioned that healthcare is 17% of GDP.
Yeah.
It's a huge percentage of the global GDP. And that too, he did refer to oligopoly, that it was hard to move that. It was hard to make an impact on that. It's an entrenched oligopolist cartel. That's 17% of GDP, when it should, by any industrialized standard country, that shouldn't be more than 3 or 4% of GDP. All that remaining trillions and trillions of dollars goes to the rapacious kleptocrats at the top who are literally stealing trillions. And it's the primary reason America's become a laughingstock, in my view.
Well, I'll tell you who's laughing, and that is the people of this huge nation. And they are celebrating their stimmies, and it is the roaring 20s for the people. So let's look at these, roaring 20 sort of numbers. This is amazing. Free money stimmies blow out consumer income and spending on goods for a glorious what the heck chart of the year. This is just freaking nuts, says Wolf Richter. It explains the record trade deficits, bottlenecks, shortages, and inflation pressures, among other distortions. So what the heck overshoot? Personal income, all sources. This is remarkable. Now, this goes back to 2015, and this is a personal income. That includes the government transfers. But these are normal times. These are the good times, right? Markets were hitting all-time highs every year, all throughout the 2015, 2016, 17, 18, 19. And during a global shutdown, all production shut down here. Here is the income of America collectively. All 330 million people, this is the household income, everything included.
Right, so to understand why this is a problem and why the comparison to the 1920s is important is because at the end of the 1920s, you had the crash and the depression. And what fueled the speculative bull market on Wall Street in the 1920s was debt or margin. People could buy stocks for 10 cents on the dollar. And this ballooned up to unsustainable levels, and it crashed, and we had the depression. So how does the debt, you already mentioned that there's 200% debt to stock market valuation.
226%.
Right, so that's one indication of how much debt. It's way past where it was in the 1920s. How about the Federal Reserve Bank? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank, they say they've got something like $7 or $8 trillion worth of assets on their balance sheets. The resale value of those assets is maybe 50 cents. Right, because
that's being very optimistic.
Right, because they technically those assets have zero value. If they put them on their books at 100 cents on the dollar, but they had to buy them from bankrupt institutions that would have had to declare bankruptcy, like JP Morgan. Instead, they swapped the insolvent junk on their balance sheets for fresh treasury bills, liquefying the banks, like Warren Buffett. That's how he made his billions, stealing from America. And they put it on the Fed's balance sheet until such time as it is a huge warehouse full of nitrate, plutonium and nitrate sitting next to a fireworks factory, right? At some point, those two come together and kaboom.
Right. But the ordinary people, you're going to love. This is the phase of a Ponzi that you love. You don't say no to this, right? How do you say no to this? Your income collectively, everybody around you, was 19 trillion in 2019, just 2 years ago. Today, it's over 24 trillion, right? Okay, that's a lot more money.
What?
Yeah, 19 trillion up to 24 trillion. That's the income across America. A lot of it printed up, sold to the Fed, to a whole banana republic sort of thing. Here is the consumer durables purchases chart. Again, here's going back to 2008. That's a financial crisis when it dipped. Look at that, the what the heck chart of durable goods. These are like washing machines and refrigerators and all that sort of stuff. Huge surge. So all that money is being spent by a lot of people, a lot into the savings, but a lot into these durable goods. And that's why you see this huge congestion in the freight business, all the goods, all the money being thrown like Spanky out the window, the little rascals at China. Here, China, take my money. China sends over, a refrigerator for you or a washing machine.
So the income went from 19 to 24 trillion since 2019, and that $5 trillion we know from tracking the cargo ships between here and Asia. So that $5 trillion we sent to China.
Essentially, a lot of it, especially because in the past year, a lot of services, which you obviously are harder to export. But, so if you get your haircut, school, rent, all that sort of stuff, that's counted under services. People haven't been paying their rent. They haven't been paying their mortgage. I mean, even that income doesn't count for the fact that you haven't also been paying any of your debts. You haven't been paying your mortgage or rent or your school loans. Like there's been moratoriums on all of that. So they're doubly wealthy. There's a double roaring 20s. Like this is just because it's like having the roaring 20s plus all those programs of the 1930s of FDR's programs of the New Deal.
Oh, I get it. That's interesting. So you take all the New Deal and you combine it with the 20s, roaring 20s speculation and debt.
Yes.
And you put it together.
Yeah.
And we have to come up with something different than the roaring 20s. It has to be something like the psychotic 20s.
Yeah, because it's going to crash because that's what happens, a crack up boom, and the whole thing collapses like Hyman Minsky says. And Hyman Minsky, of course, saw that coming and still lost everything in the Great Depression. So, there's that. But here they're saying this is going to crash, so we might as well just implement the programs now to recover.
I get it. They're doing the FDR rollout now. That's why Joe Biden, they compare him to FDR.
Yes.
And they refer him as 3 letters now. Whatever his middle name is J something B. They think he's like LBJ, FDR, and J something B. So they're combining the two. They're taking the worst qualities of those 2 decades and they're combining it into 1 decade called the psychotic 20s.
Yes. So we are in the roaring 20s, literally and figuratively. And this could have a whole lot further to run. We could outdo the 1920s. The stock markets are already more overvalued than they were in 1921 by all the metrics that matter. And so we're already past that. But how do we double that from there? Warren Buffett kind of based his theories of once the stock market capitalization.
You know what's hilarious? Is that there's only one thing that hasn't gone up. And if you read Peter Schiff's Twitter, you know what it is.
That's gold.
Gold.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the reason why we can continue this bubble, by the way, for longer and bigger than what happened in the last roaring 20s. This is the roaring 20s. Right now it's repeating, but it's going to start to rhyme instead because it's going to get way bigger.
Wow, this is awesome. I can hardly wait. This could be the best year ever. Stay tuned for the second half. A lot more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with legendary James Turk of goldmoney.com. James, welcome back.
Thank you, Max.
Okay, to follow up on our conversation about the numéraire needed on any economic system. You need hard money. You need a unit of account. I want to hypothetically put you into a radio control tower at the airport. And the airplane is about to come in to land. And it radios in, James, I need a runway. Can you give me a runway? And your answer is, well, what runway would you feel like landing on? Does that make any sense? And is that what Jay Powell effectively is doing as leader of the Fed?
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it, Max. Made me chuckle a little bit. Yeah, numeraire is a fixed unit, and that's what you need in order for calculation, whether it's an ounce of gold, an ounce of silver, but some kind of precious metal to determine how you calculate the price of goods and services. That's why I always like to use this example of crude oil over the last 70 years. Today, an ounce of gold buys the same amount of crude oil it did 70 years ago, but a dollar buys just a fraction of what it bought 70 years ago because of inflation. So you need that numeraire, and without it, you're lost, just like that airplane trying to land.
There was a great debate recently between Frank Giustra and Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy. It was the gold versus Bitcoin debate. And one point that came up, which I thought was interesting, is that Frank, in talking about gold, was saying, look, I've got 10% of my portfolio in gold as a hedge. And Michael Saylor was saying, look, the reason I buy, and the reason he's got that in there as a hedge is because of all the money printing and the irresponsibility and everything we're talking about here. Michael Saylor was saying, look, the reason I own Bitcoin is it's more than a hedge. It's actually a solution to this problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it. You said in the other time we were chatting earlier that we've known each other for 15 years, and back years ago when Bitcoin was first getting started, you and I had a number of conversations, and it took me a little bit to get over the hurdle of what it was. But when it reached $100, I became a believer that Bitcoin was, and I've said it in subsequent interviews that can be found on the internet, that it was the currency of the future. And I still believe that because it is proven to be an escape currency. It's a way of getting your purchasing power into something that's relatively safe. But I'd like to make a point, comparing it to gold, because, people try to say that they're antagonistic to one another, but in fact, they're complementary to one another, because the weaknesses of gold are the strengths of Bitcoin, and the weaknesses of Bitcoin are the strengths of gold. And by that, what I mean is that you can hold a gold coin in your hand. You can't do that with a Bitcoin. But gold, because you can hold it in your hand, can be confiscated, but you can't confiscate Bitcoin because it's distributed throughout the world in the internet. So the two are really complementary to one another. And if you feel like you need to own gold in your portfolio, and everybody should as a hedge, you might also want to consider a cryptocurrency in your portfolio as well, like Bitcoin.
Yeah, I know three people over there at Gold Money: James Turk, Roy Sabag, and Peter Schiff, talking about gold and Bitcoin. Two of those people seem really informed and keyed in on exactly what's going on. Peter Schiff does not, and yet he's the most vocal. How does he? Never mind. I don't even want to talk about it. Okay, let's move on. So, James Turk, the IMF recently argued that we need a new Bretton Woods agreement, a great reset. Okay, so a little historical. Give us some historical lessons here. Bretton Woods, after World War II, the United States took over. U.S. dollar was the world reserve currency. It was backed by gold. Now we're 2021. Everything's going to the garbage. Are they going to try a new Bretton Woods? What are they going to do?
Yeah, Bretton Woods was just a government organization to try to create a numeraire for the international monetary system. That was the principal thing. But the secondary thing that it did was to try to remove gold from the international monetary system, to remove that discipline that kept central banks from printing too much money and too much currency. The history of money in the 20th century is trying to separate national currencies from gold because central banks and governments didn't want to live within the discipline that gold imposes on the monetary system. And we now have a monetary system nationally, internationally, without any kind of discipline, which is why we have these problems today and why we're on this path to hyperinflation. It's interesting because Bretton Woods came just at the closing of World War II. But the other example at World War II that was, in my mind, interesting to explain a little bit about monetary history and the importance of gold is what happened in West Germany when the Allies, the French, Germans, the French, British, and the Americans created the predecessor for the Bundesbank, what they did is they made the Bundesbank completely separate and distinct from the government so that the Bundesbank could say no to buying government bonds. Because what had happened is that the Allies realized that in order to fight a war, you have to have control of the currency. And they had just won 2 wars against the Germans. They didn't want to fight a third. So they made sure that there was that political discipline between the Bundesbank and the government. And the irony is that they didn't impose it on themselves. They only imposed it on Germany. And it worked very, very well. The Bundesbank did a remarkable job in managing the national currency, the Deutschmark, up until the euro. But now the Bundesbank has become irrelevant relative to the European Central Bank, which is under political control. So that's the lesson of the 20th century, Max. You have to remove the currency process from government control. Right now, governments are 100% in control of the currency, and they're heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, the Bundesbank was really sensitive to inflation and very disciplined. Then when Mario Draghi was over there at the ECB, and the ECB essentially took over from the Bundesbank when the introduction of the euro. And then he started to do all this quantitative easing-like policy and expanding their balance sheet dramatically. And so they lost all their discipline and they've become a basket case, just like the U.S. dollar. You know, one of your colleagues, Alistair MacLeod, over there at Gold Money, the always excellent Alistair MacLeod, you know, he thinks the dollar is going to frickin' collapse. You know, he doesn't even think it's going to make it to the 50th anniversary this August. Stan Druckenmiller is, quote, very, very short the dollar. So there's one thing to say, oh, the dollar is fading away and it's going to be replaced. But for some very smart people, they think it's actually within months of utterly collapsing. How do you weigh in on that?
I agree with Alistair. I think we're very, very close. You know, Ludwig von Mises, who was the greatest economist in the 20th century, came up with this term called the crack-up boom. You know, he saw the hyperinflation in Austria after the First World War. And typically you have 6 to 12 months when the currency collapses, once you're in that hyperinflationary crack-up boom. And I think we probably have already started the crack-up boom in most countries around the world today, including the United States, which is why everything is going sky high. You know, people exiting the currency. It may take longer than 6 to 12 months, though, because we have more regimentation and more controls on people today than there were in Austria after the First World War. So maybe it's going to be a 12-month or 24-month, you know, crack-up boom. But if we don't get off this road toward hyperinflation, if we don't stop turning U.S. government paper into currency, the dollar will hyperinflate.
All right, Stan Druckenmiller, stick on him for a second. He also says he's very long Asia, as they are the only economy left standing after COVID. They did not have to increase their money supply at the same pace. Is China to the post-COVID era as the U.S. was to the post-World War II era? James.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, you know, the geopolitics and everything. And the only issue that I have with China is the rule of law is not well established. Private property rights are not well established. And that's a concern to me because, you know, in a free market economy, the core element is private property rights. So, yeah, you know, Asia is, I think, an alternative investment area. I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket. You know, I would diversify, you know, globally, which is, I think, really the best strategy. You know, not only invest in your home country, but in, you know, put some of your purchasing power in a variety of different countries, a variety of different investments around the world.
Right. Well, even Warren Buffett has just put a huge amount of capital of his firm into Japan. And so clearly there's Asia going on there. The U.S., James, wants to stop the Belt and Road Initiative, which one could argue is similar to a post-World War II Marshall Plan. How do you think this Thucydides trap will play out? That is to say, the rise of China and the fall of the U.S. You know, we've seen these kinds of musical chairs amongst empires now going back thousands of years. Does the U.S. engage China in hot war? In other words, is the U.S. just going to go quietly as China moves up to the top dog, or is it going to be a hot war?
Can't predict that one, Max. Let's all hope that it's going to be, you know, quiet and no wars. I think conventional wisdom is that eventually there will be a war, but you know, I'd take the contrary point of view and say there isn't going to be a war because everybody knows how bad it can be. We've seen it. We know what can happen, and I think everybody wants to avoid it. So let's hope that that's the case. But there is a point here that is important, that empires die when the currency dies. And I think, again, coming back to the dollar, if we don't get off this road, the American empire, which isn't supposed to be an empire anyway, it's supposed to be a republic. There's some serious issues going ahead in terms of geopolitics if we don't fix this currency.
Right. Fix the currency, James Turk. If only you were running the Fed, James, life would be better for everyone. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max. It's always great to be with you.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, James Turk of goldmoney.com. Until next time. Bye, y'all.